German philosopher Max Weber does extensive work on politics and the state, and even sort of other areas that are just kind of tangentially related, like bureaucracies, authority, power, and so on. And he does most of this work on the state specifically in two main pieces. One of them is titled Politics as Vocation, which is just a transcript of a lecture that he gave. But then his sort of magnum opus, his life work, is Economy and Society. In both of those areas, he talks about politics and the state extensively. So what does Weber have to say about the state? I'm going to read an excerpt from Politics as Vocation. So this is the lecture that he gave, where he gives sort of his most simplistic definition of the state. This is probably the most widely used definition of states to this day, ranging across various disciplines. He says, "What is a political association from the sociological point of view? What is a state? Sociologically, the state cannot be defined in terms of its ends. There is scarcely any task that some political association has not taken in hand, and there is no task that one could say has always been exclusive and peculiar to those associations which are designed as political ones. Today, the state, or historically those associations which have been predecessors of the modern state. Ultimately, one can define the modern state sociologically only in terms of the specific means peculiar to it, as to every political association, namely the use of physical force." So Weber says, we can't possibly define a state by what it hopes to achieve. We have to define a state by how it achieves what it achieves. He continues, "Every state is founded on force," said Trotsky at Brest-Litovsk. "This is indeed right. If no such institutions existed which knew the use of violence, then the concept of state would be eliminated, and a condition would emerge that could be designated as anarchy, in the specific sense of the word. Not anarchy like we typically view it like the purge, but anarchy as in a completely equal, non-hierarchical society." He continues, "Of course, force is certainly not the normal or the only means of the state. Nobody says that. But force is a means specific to the state. Today, the relation between the state and violence is an especially intimate one. In the past, the most varied institutions, beginning with the SIB meaning sibling family, have known the use of physical force as quite normal. Today, however, we have to say that, and here we go, this is his definition, a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Note that territory is one of the characteristics of a state. Specifically, at the present time, the right to use physical force is ascribed to other institutions or individuals only to the extent to which the state permits it. The state is considered the sole source of the right to use violence. Hence, politics for us means striving to share power or striving to influence the distribution of power either among states or among groups within states." I'm going to read just the first part of that again. "A state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory." For Weber, the state has everything to do with the use of violence, and who has the monopoly on that use of legitimate violence. Legitimate violence is violence which is institutionalized and viewed as correct or right or justified. Illegitimate violence is very clearly the opposite of that. So for Weber, the state is whichever group of human beings in a society has the monopoly on the use of legitimate violence. And they may, as he says, ascribe the use of that violence to other organizations, but they still exist as the state through their right to ascribe that use of violence to other people or other groups of people or other institutions. So the state has everything to do with power and violence. We're going to put a pin in Weber's conversations of power, which he does extensively, and in fact he has some of the most famous sociological, political, and philosophical definitions of power that are widely used, but we'll save that for a unit specifically on power and the state. He goes on then in Economy and Society mainly to talk about how states came into being. I'll leave it to you to read the details there, but it's interesting to think about Weber's theories in the context of histories of states and how states formed and when we might say the first states came about. He suggests that violence had existed, but it wasn't until a certain group of people became the most powerful to such an extent that they could control who had the right and who didn't have the right to use violence. Now, other things go along with that very clearly. Weber talks extensively about legality and law and codifying practices and behaviors. Very clearly, you can't establish a monopoly on violence, or at the very least, it's very difficult in modern times to do so without laws to back your use of violence. So just as a sort of example that's not perfect, but in American society, much of the violence that is demonstrated on behalf of the police we view as legal and legitimate. And as an example, just given current times and current context, the violence that is utilized by protesters, American society in general, and definitely American law, views that violence as illegitimate. So between those two parties, the police and the protesters, using Weber's definition, it's very clear for us which is the state, which group of people has the monopoly on violence. I really like Weber's definition in its simplicity because it gives us a great tool to analyze states and societies and different communities. We can look at any group of people, and if we're trying to identify who controls the state or who the state is or what the state is and the institutions that are associated with the state, we can very clearly identify, and usually pretty quickly, what organization controls the use of legitimate violence in this group or in this territory. That will always be the state for Weber. So Weber's definition is really simple, which is probably why it's most widely used. It's the state is any group of people or institution that claims the monopoly on the use of legitimate violence. However, it's only simple at the surface. We have to dig into the different depths that are present and implied within this definition, like power, and what is legitimacy? How does something become legitimate? The use of law in modern society, economic relationships, and so on. But in general, Weber's definition of the state is any group or institution or organization that claims the monopoly on the use of legitimate violence in a society.